another print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hi, this is Dick Shanley, and for the next hour, I will be reading from Sunday's May 31st issue of the New York Times opinion section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. First article is Hungary shows the world how to defeat an autocrat. Starting early in the morning of the second Saturday of May, first hundreds and then thousands of people gathered in the square in front of Hungary's majestic parliament to celebrate the start of a new political era. This was the square where thousands gathered in 1956, 1989 to demand an end to the Soviet occupation, and in 2006 to protest the discredited government. It was the square in which Prime Minister Viktor Orban's regime imposed a major redesign more than a decade ago, with traffic rerouted away, a large reflecting pool and raised beds installed, narrow pathways laid down, apparently to ensure that no such mass gathering would take place again. Today it was a square where Peter Magyar, a former Orban loyalist, would be sworn in, promising rebirth of democracy and liberty after 16 years of autocratic control. Squeezing into the available spaces and gradually filling up nearby cafes and streets, the crowd absorbed people of all ages, young people who didn't remember a time before Orban and who had voted in unprecedented numbers, aging intellectuals who didn't think they'd ever celebrate their country again, multi-generational families who had arrived by bus and seeing Magyar in the hometowns and villages. During his campaign, Magyar had traveled to an estimated 700 locations, turning many of them into Tisza Island's outpost of support for his party. By the end, Magyar was holding 5 or more rallies a day. It had looked like an important quest. It had looked like an impossible quest. Orban and his cronies dominated the media, persecuted and smeared opposition politicians, and changed election laws to benefit his party, Fidesz. Orban has seemed to achieve what the Hungarian sociologist and political theorist Balma Magyar, no relation, calls autocratic breakthrough. The point after which it is impossible to unseat an autocrat using elections, illiberal politicians from other countries, pilgrimage to Hungary to learn from Orban. CPAC, the Gathering for American National Conservatives, started staging an annual convention there, and Vice President J.D. Vance visited Budapest in advance of the election in a show of support for Orban. And yet, Hungarians handed Tisza not just a victory, but a constitutional majority. Enough power to reverse Orban's changes to Hungarian laws and institutions. The triumph was stunning, unique in our era of democratic backsliding, and it holds clear lessons for the United States. One obvious lesson by Peter Magyar's success lies in the scale, the reach, and relentlessness of his organizing network. They had 2,000 Tisza Islands, between 30,000 and 50,000 volunteers. Balmut Magyar told me in evident awe. Just in the call centers, they had 3,000 to 4,000 people in the last week of the campaign. We talked 2 days before the swearing-in ceremony at his office in the spectacular but largely empty building of Central European University. And 2018, Orban's government forced most of the university's operation into exile. Amid an anti-Semitic scare campaign focused on the Hungarian philanthropist George Soros, the CEO's founder and principal funder. Some of Orban's many other scare campaigns targeted migrants, the Brussels elites, and LGBTQ people. During the latest election campaign, billboards and AI-generated social media posts warned Hungarians they were in danger of being overtaken by Ukraine, and only Orban could protect them. It should have seemed absurd. It was absurd. Less outlandish xenophobic and anti-Semitic propaganda had served Orban well for years. It didn't work against Peter Magyar, probably because so many Hungarians got to see him in person, many of them repeatedly. This is another lesson of his success. Old-fashioned in-person politics can be powerful antidote to media fear-mongering. In his inaugural speech to Parliament, broadcast on giant screens set up around the square, Peter Magyar said that voters had handed him a mandate, not just to change the government, but to change the system, to start over. Magyar enumerated the ways in which Orban had damaged Hungary, a stalled economy in which a third of the population lives in poverty, inadequate health care, low-quality schools, child welfare institutions plagued by abuse, an atmosphere of hatred and fear. Orban's regime had stolen from the common good of the Hungarian action, from the pockets of the Hungarian people, and from the tables of Hungarian children and the elders. Magyar said an estimated 20 trillion Hungarian forints, or some $65 billion over the last decade and a half. Previous opposition politicians had described Orban's regime as corrupt, a relatively mild term suggesting some aberration from the government's intended function. Peter Magyar made no such accommodation. Borrowing a term coined by Balint Magyar, he has called a mafia state, a fundamentally criminal enterprise. Third lesson, don't mince words. Instead of shrinking away from direct confrontation, he fortified himself against it by getting elected to the European Parliament in 2024. He secured immunity from prosecution in Hungary. When rumors circulated of an intimate video that could be used to blackmail him, he went on the offensive, accusing Orban of using Russian-style kompromat. No video was released. Knowing that he would probably be blocked from registering a new political party, he took over one and had become dormant. Even more important, instead of trying to build coalitions among other parties, he focused on conscripting as many actual people as possible from across the political spectrum, ultimately building a giant organization of taking Orban's political monopoly. One would say that some Magyar won at least in part because, as a former insider of Orban's Fidesz, but my interlocutors in Hungary emphasized that Magyar's credibility lay in the fact that he was not a member of the old opposition, whose policies had led to the discontentment that made Orban's rise possible, and whose minority had helped perpetuate Orban's war. That's a lesson too. The person would not be anti-plump Republican, but an outsider to the Democratic establishment, someone who can readily claim that they didn't happen on his watch, a grand planner rather than a Thomas Massie. For all his tireless work over the last 2 years, Magyar tireless Magyar did not create his political machine from scratch. Like Zoran Madami, Magyar excelled in converting potential supporters into campaign volunteers. Annex News Distribution Service provided initial skeleton of the organizing network, panoply of grassroots protest events. Another lesson lies in the issue that motivated Magyar's voters. Hungary's economy is a mess, but post-election polling by Median, an organization that had predicted election results with uncanny accuracy, shows that voters saw corruption as the most important issue by far. That's why they thought Orban had lost. 48% cited corruption, and only 18% thought the worsening economic situation, rising cost of living. The next three reconciled were lies, 15%, fear-mongering, war rhetoric, 11%, and people got fed up, 10%. In other words, Hungarians seem to see the damage that Orban had done to the nation as far more important than any harm they felt they had suffered as individuals. They were united by a case of moral outrage, value choices, as persons chose to the incoming government described to use. Polls have consistently shown that even Fidesz voters generally want Hungary to stay in the European Union. Some just say they want the ease of travel and residency. Others probably have in mind the loftier ideals of the European Union, such as the rule of the human rights and the essential purpose of the EU, which is peace. Hungary is one of the poorer countries in the Union, and in the early years of the regime, Orban was able to use EU members to secure funding and thereby power, even as he railed against the Brussels bureaucracy. But in 2022, the European Union started withholding funding and citing corruption. And in 2024, after Hungary ruling that compelled to process asylum applications, the court ordered Hungary to pay 200 million euros and imposed a daily fine of €1 million when Orban refused to pay. Brussels deduced the money from EU funds earmarked of Hungary. These actions just didn't hurt if Hungary's agrarian economy, but also allowed Magyar to draw a casual connection with the policies and the well-being of ordinary voters. One of the major campaign promises to unlock EU funding. Peter Magyar scheduled his inauguration for Europe Day, the 76th anniversary of the declaration that created the roadmap for a united continent. Before it was sworn in, the European flag was raised again. But the skeletal flag remains, signaling that Magyar seeks to represent all Hungarian citizens, including those who supported Orban. In some U.S. coverage, Magyar had been labeled centrist or right of center, with his politics actually are, and this is another lesson of his victory, is pluralistic. Peter Magyar's rise began in February 2024 when he gave an interview to the independent media called Partizan. He blasted Orban for corruption and failure to represent Hungarians, but most explosively for different issues altogether, covering up the sexual abuse of children in state care. A case involving more than 4 dozen defendants had made its way through the courts, but Orban apparently instructed his justice to pardon several of them. 2 women who had signed off on them at the time, President Caitlin Novak and Justice Minister Judith Vargas, who was then Magar's wife, ended up resigning. Magar accused Orban's regime of hiding behind women's skirts. Remarkably, in nearby Poland, the only other European country to have unseated an autocratic government, a child sex abuse scandal and a cover-up also appear to have played a significant role. Perhaps this is because such stories can shed a particular harsh light on networks of power and the abuses of power. This too is a lesson that can prove useful in the United States. Perhaps it already has. Now, speaking of Parliament, the new Hungarian Prime Minister offered an extensive and detailed apologies to the victims of abuse and those who sought justice in their behalf. And he announced that in reaction with the crimes of the Orban regime, he was submitting legislation to create the National Asset Recovery and Protection Office, which he promised would be one of the pillars of the 2026 regime change. Everyone I interviewed in Hungary insisted that regime change would not be complete until a full accounting of the abuses of the Orban regime had occurred and those guilty of crimes were punished. Though no one, including the people whose job it will be to ensure that justice is served, seemed to have a clear idea of how this process could be organized. It's evident, however, that its goal would be not only to satisfy the desire for retribution, but also to separate those who became rich through the connections to the Orban regime from the millions of ordinary voters who enabled it, as an essential step toward healing a society that has been ruled by politics of hatred, anger, and suspicion. There's a lesson to that also. Like many other autocrats and aspiring autocrats, Vladimir Putin, Benjamin Netanyahu, Donald Trump, Orban have been apparently desperate to maintain power because if he lost his office, he could face criminal charges. For this reason, even as Peter Magar surged in the polls, and even on election day, an early return pointed to Tisa's overwhelming victory. Many Hungarians assumed Orban would find a way to cling to power. Would he refuse to acknowledge election results? Would he declare martial law? But even after he authorized lump sum payments of 6 months in salary to members of the uniformed service, military personnel were said to be overwhelming in favor of change. Orban must have known he could not count on them. He stepped down from Parliament after the election, and on inauguration day, he wasn't in the building. Neither were several of his most prominent members of Fidesz, the party he still leads, which won roughly a fourth of the seats on the legislature. President Thomas Suluk, an Orban loyalist, was there, however. Before Magar took his oath of office, Suluk delivered an anodyne speech about the importance of the rule of law and constitutional order. Magar refused to play along. It is ironic to hear him speak of the rule of law now after 2 years of silence, he said. Mr. President, you remained silent when the failed prime minister called half the country, those who opposed him, insects to be exterminated. You expressed no concern when the secret services were sent after the largest opposition party. You failed to speak up when billions in public funds were used to spread war hatred among Hungarians, including among our children. After so much cowardice and turning a blind eye, how could you represent the unity of this nation? You cannot. It is time to leave with your head held high while you still have the chance. Hungarians think of themselves as the polite and observed people. They arrive on time, they observe decorum. They refrain from confrontation. On election night, however, they had shocked themselves by dancing in the streets chanting, "It's over!" And now their new prime minister was shocking them again. Inside Parliament there was a silence, but the thousands of people watching the speech on the outdoor screen broke out in screams and applause. And when the cameras cut to Sulyok, his face frozen in an uncomfortable half smile, the crowd let out a round of boos that could probably be heard on the other side of the Danube. Earlier this morning, Magyar and Agnes Forssoffer, the new Speaker of Parliament, had laid wreaths on a statue of Attila József, an early 20th century poet whose poem by the Danube is a hymn to the Hungarian diversity. It ends with this stanza, understood as a call for settling differences. Here is the poem. The battle which our ancestors once fought, though recollection is resolved in peace, and settling at long last the price of thought. This is our task, and none too short its lease. Most of József's poetry is considered as complex as to be untranslatable. And so when the new political leaders laid flowers at his statue to the accompaniment of a Mozart clarinet concerto, they were projecting a new old article toward high culture. Here is another lesson of Magyar's victory. His politics are spiritual and inspirational, a tone that is an antidote to the cynicism and vulgarity of autocracy. It is the opposite of, say, the approach taken by California government Gavin Newsom, who trolls Trump by trying to outperform him in the debasement of political language and political life. Speaking at the Parliament, which Magyar called the most beautiful buildings in the world, and it may well be, he was proclaiming a new era of beauty and love. Forssoffer had used the word love 4 times in her own brief speech. As Magyar wrapped up his speech to Parliament, he announced that he had invited an ensemble of Roma children to perform. The person I was standing with is Zofia Ben, one of Hungary's most celebrated authors, and a person of unaccustomed to participating in exuberant displays of optimism, and she told me it felt like cross-dressing. Teared up, nothing like this has ever happened in Parliament. The Roma people constitute 8% of the Hungarian population, making them one of Hungary's largest minority groups, and arguably the poorest, and most often discriminated against. Magyar had spoken extensively about the plight of Roma children, which he seemed to learn about on the campaign trail. A dozen and a half preteen boys wearing white shirts and black bow ties played flambeurs and sang a song considered an anthem of Hungarian Roma people, followed by a Hungarian folk song. Several newly elected members of parliament wept openly, but members of the elected from the far right, our Homeland Party, had left the chamber in protest. The deputy leader of this faction, Dora Duro, had held a news conference to physically rip up one of Bond's children's books, which he labeled homosexual propaganda. It had been very good for book sales, but I know what it's like to be denounced by people in your own country. I asked Ban how she felt, knowing that Duro was still a member of parliament. They have lost, she responded. When Magar emerged from the building and addressed the assembled crowd, he offered his own lesson of his impossible victory. Against the machine of power, he said, we don't need another machine of power, but real people who are going from mailbox to mailbox, house to house, in the cold, the frost, and the rain, are capable of anything for their homeland, their numbers, their relatives, and their community. The next task was to rediscover how to see ourselves as a community once again, he said. Therefore, I ask you to turn those compatriots who are disappointed today, who are afraid, who experience this period as a loss. Do not try to defeat them. Do not look down on them. Listen to them and talk to them. Tell them that this country belongs to them too, that they are needed just as ever needed, and that together we will rebuild Hungary, because there is no left, there is no right. It's only Hungarians. One of the secrets of Peter Magar's success, Beitel Magar had told me, lay in reclaiming the symbols of the nation, the flag, the national anthem, the very idea of Hungarianness. Now Peter Magar was watching over an elaborate national performance, the raising of the flag, soldiers goose-stepping, cavalry in the ornate uniform. And then the pageantry was over, but Magar was still separated from the crowd by large expanses of empty spaces, the distance that Orban government had so carefully engineered. Magar started motioning to the crowd, come closer, come closer. But people were already pressed up against the edge of the reflecting pool. After a few minutes, the excitement and the desire to be fully a part of the historic moment became too much to resist. Some men hiked up their pants and ran across the pool, which it turned out was just a couple of inches deep. Almost immediately, hundreds more followed. They ran, splashing through the water and onto the other side, filling the space which had so long been excluded. This is your house now, Magar explained. Everyone I interviewed on this trip to Budapest believes in this new era. Academics believe that they will be free to teach again. Young people believe that they will be the first generation in years for whom staying in Hungary is a desirable option. Civil society activists believe that they will be able to stop fighting for their own survival and focus on helping the people they want to help. Marta Pardavi, co-chair of the only organization in Hungary that provides free legal representation for people seeking asylum, was even hopeful, despite the absence of any such promises, that the new government would resume accepting asylum applications. Experts I talked to outside of Hungary's are more skeptical, concerned about the blood and soil notes that have been heard in Magar's speeches. Sure that his focus on the plight of the Roma people were just a calculated overture towards Brussels, made in hopes of unlocking EU funds. On the other hand, isn't that what the European government is for? To encourage and enforce humanistic values? It's too early to say anything about Magar's policies, but his cabinet choices seem consistent with the inclusive spirit of his campaign, politically and socially. Magar finished speaking, ceding the change to Ibola Ula, a pop star who is ethnically Roma and openly lesbian. She performed Margarula Sag, Hungry, a ballad that she had not performed many years because she had said its patriotic sentiment had lost its meaning. And Ban, a friend of hers, said, I sat down in a cafe and ordered Aperol spritzes. To the first day of democracy, Ban said, and we clinked our glasses. The owner of the cafe, who recognized Ban, brought us creme-filled muffins. Ban danced in her chair along to Queen. "We are the champions." I asked her how she felt about placing her hopes in a politician who had come from the right wing, had seemingly never said a word in defense of immigrants, and had barely spoken up for the rights of LGBTQ people. Could he be a wolf in revolutionary clothing? "Maybe he is," she said, smiling broadly. "Maybe he is." And then we danced our way through the square to the Icona pop song with the refrain, "I don't care, I love it." People of all ages were dancing in a conga line and taking their hands off one another's shoulders and high-five us. The party is in the square continued into the next day. Editorial comment. This was a wonderful article. It was written by a columnist by the name of M. Geeson, Gessen. Unfortunately, I don't know if Geeson were feminine or masculine. Not that it matters, but if it was from a woman's point of view, it might be a bit different than a man's point of view. So let's hope that Mr. Magar does well. A presidential masterclass in what not to do. This is written by David French. Why Trump is losing the war in Iran. At the moment, the United States is negotiating with the regime that President Trump claimed we had already changed to end a nuclear program that we said we had obliterated. We're doing that as news continues to emerge that the war wasn't as one-sided as we were told. In the opening days and weeks of the war, administration repeatedly trumpeted an uninterrupted string of American military successes, while remaining largely mum about the effectiveness of Iranian attacks. We had embarrassed and humiliated Iran, Peter Hegseth said. We could fly anywhere, strike anywhere, sink anything. The Iranian military was ravaged. Its navy was at the bottom of the ocean, its air force was decimated, and its missile forces were depleted. Or so we were told. Does not disrespect or diminish American skill and courage to note that Iranian military was more effective, and American strikes perhaps less effective than we were led to believe. As more information filters out, the picture gets cloudier and cloudier. Not only was Iran able to immediately and decisively close the Strait of Hormuz, it's now clear that the Iranian regime inflicted significant damage on American bases in the region and significant damage on oil, natural gas production around the Persian Gulf. In addition, in spite of the U.S. air superiority, the Islamic Republic was able to damage or destroy at least 42 manned and unmanned American aircraft. And its open question is how much we damaged the Iranian missile program. Intelligence reports suggest that the United States has depleted a substantial percentage of its missile stock to destroy a small fraction of Iran's. We have weakened the Iran military, but the regime is unbeaten and unbowed. If anything, its regional and global position may even be stronger than it was before the war. Why did this happen? Why did America find itself in a situation in which the military performed its assigned mission with competence and courage, but without achieving, at least so far, the desired strategic effect? The answer is found in leadership, history, and civics. Yes, civics. Let's start with leadership. Trump's performance as commander-in-chief is a perfect illustration of why he was never an acceptable choice for president. It's clear that Trump had a wildly unrealistic Plan A and no viable Plan B. He has repeatedly compared Iran to Venezuela. It seems he thought that a jihadist regime that endured hundreds and thousands of casualties during the Iran-Iraq war has persisted with its weapons development program in the face of crippling sanctions, industrial sabotage, and target assassinations, and is a theocracy full of people willing to die for their beliefs, would have exactly like a corrupt South American regime that shares none of these characteristics. As a result, when Iran did not fold after the successful decapitation strike against the nation's leadership, Trump had no plan beyond keep bombing, at least for a little while. But it's not just Trump. It's no coincidence that the Iran war is going far worse than the fight against ISIS that started under Barack Obama and culminated during Trump's first term. The military, along with our allies from the region and across the globe, destroyed the ISIS caliphate and ended its reign of terror in the Middle East. At that time, however, the Trump administration was staffed with professionals, not toadies and not lackeys. It turns out that there really is a difference between the military led by James Mattis and the military led by Hegseth. Mattis is among our most military astute and politically deft battlefield commanders. Hegseth is the former Fox News host who possesses limited military experience and seems to think that defeating wokeness, whatever that means, is a principal part of his job. But his bench presses are generally impressive, I'll give him that. Now on to history. With every new development of aerial technology, the cry goes out, now bombing really can win a war. We've made this mistake again and again. In World War II, we said that the bomber will always get through and believed that daylight strategic bombing would break the back of Hitler's Germany. Strategic bombing was important, no doubt, but it took millions of men fighting in the mud to finally finish off the Nazi regime. One could argue that the air power did finish off the war in Japan, of course, but that was through the use of weapons we pray that humanity never uses again. In Vietnam, aerial campaigns such as Rolling Thunder were designed to achieve decisive results, but they did not win the war. Even relatively successful campaigns, such as the 1972 Christmas bombings that forced North Vietnam back to the negotiating table, didn't end the war on terms favorable to the United States and its allies. And in Operation Iraq Freedom, we hoped the initial shock and awe would achieve greater results, but in the end took years of grinding ground combat to first dispose Saddam Hussein, and then to finally vanquish al-Qaeda in Iraq. Then, when ISIS arose, it took a combination of Allied air power and Iraqi soldiers on the ground to beat ISIS. Why did we think that this time things would be different, especially when drones are changing warfare in a way that we are only just beginning to understand? Finally, let's deal with the most exciting subject of all, civics. As I've said time and time again, the Constitution requirement that Congress declare war is no more technicality. It reflects a clear understanding of how democracies should wage war, both for the benefit of the democracy and for the good of the war effort. The process of seeking congressional support can stress test the war plan, and if the case for the war cannot survive skeptical questions, then the war should not be fought. In the absence of an extreme emergency that requires an immediate response, the decision is simply too consequential to be left in the hands of one person. When democratic governments wage wars with public support, they can demonstrate extraordinary resolve and staying power. In the absence of that support, even a matter as temporary as high gas prices lead to cries for peace. The result is an asymmetric commitment, with the regime willing to bear any burden and pay any price, including with the lives of citizens, to maintain power, and Americans unwilling to bear such a burden at all. And why should they? No one asked them to approve the expense in blood and treasure, nor has anyone explained why it's necessary. I do not for a minute think the military is perfect. I'm deeply grieved, for example, by the mistake of an Iranian elementary school that took so many lives at the onset of the war. As a former JAG officer, I know very well that some soldiers and some commanders can go rogue and commit atrocities against soldiers and civilians alike. I didn't want to believe the reports from Abu Ghraib, for example, until I saw the pictures that removed all doubt. It's hard, however, to blame the military for the present debacle. As near as we can tell, it has performed its mission with extreme skill. Its rescue of 2 drowned crewmen deep in Iran was an extraordinary display of courage and skill, as was the mission that snatched Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela. Nor can we presume that military leaders failed to warn Trump in Iran would respond exactly as he did. In fact, there's reporting that suggests that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Case, did warn Trump that Iran would try to close the Strait of Hormuz, and Trump brushed it off. One of the realistic military life is that soldiers are law and honor-bound to refuse unlawful orders, but they have no grounds for refusing stupid orders. I'm retired of Tennyson's poem, Charge of the Light Brigade, once a high school staple. While Americans in Iran have suffered far few casualties than the British cavalry in the Battle of Balaclava in 1854, the lessons are the same. Here's the poem. Forward the Light Brigade, was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. There's not to make a reply, there's not to reason why. There's but to do and die into the valley of death. Rode the 600. The poem's a bit alarming, right? Can Israel win back the world's trust? This is written by Shir Evron, is the policy chief and a senior fellow at the RAND Corporation. At the Eurovision Song Contest, Israel drew protesters as well as boycotts by Ireland, Spain, the Netherlands, Iceland, Slovenia. Days later, Israel Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich announced that the prosecution of the International Criminal Court is seeking an arrest warrant for him, and France and Poland barred another cabinet member, the National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, from entering their countries. All of this was in the past month alone. Israel's international isolation is deepening fast. A fact showing up in polls, social media wandering boycotts a new generation that the world has come to instinctively view Israel mainly as part of a story about occupation and Palestinian suffering. It is increasingly apparent that the long-standing cushions of a bipartisan safety net in Washington and cordial, if cautious, relations in Europe are dissipating. What can stop this slide? Parliamentary elections expected in the fall offer the clearest opportunity for change. Depending on the outcome, they can buy a short-lived grace period to create room for pragmatic change. A new government coalition could signal that Israel intends to answer its global critics by curbing settler violence, halting de facto annexation of West Bank's land, facilitating a plan to restructure Gaza, restoring workable ties with Palestinian institutions, and reestablish predictable democratic governance. That combination of asserting Israel's at home while offering concrete gestures abroad is the only realistic path to halt the drift into deep isolation, a dangerous state from which Israel will find it extraordinarily difficult to recover. Surveys show just how profound Israel's isolation has become. A Pew Research Center from March found that 60% of Americans now hold an unfavorable view of Israel, compared with 42% in 22. Especially worrisome is the age breakdown. Among Americans aged 18 to 49, nearly three-quarters view Israel unfavorably, including nearly 60% of young Republicans, the very demographic many Israel still assume supports the Jewish state. It is, in short, next to impossible to find a young cohort in America that looks at Israel and likes what he sees. The picture somewhere is growing worse, too. In the Pew survey last year, majorities in 20 of 24 countries held negative views of Israel. In Australia, Greece, Indonesia, Japan, Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, Turkey, the figure was close to or above three-quarters. This has clear policy implications. European Union foreign ministers this month approved sanctions on violent settlers and their backers. The EU-Israel Association agreement was nearly suspended. Several European states are pushing to ban imports of goods made in its settlements in the occupied territories. Last year, the European Commission concluded that there are breaches of Israel's human rights obligations under the EU-Israel Association Agreement. The fraying support matters because Israel's security and economy are tethered to the United States and Europe. The United States supplies advanced weapons and intelligence that underpin Israel's deterrence and gives the state diplomatic support of the UN and elsewhere. Europe provides market, partnership, investments, funding that are a lifeline for Israel research and development and academia. Losing public support abroad narrows Israel's strategic options and makes its long-term security harder to maintain. Some of the isolation results from forces beyond Israel's control. American voters tend to put priority on domestic and economic matters, with Israel rarely figuring as a positive mobilizing issue. Other polls show that declining support for Israel relative to the Palestinians. Young Americans put a priority on human rights and are less likely be religiously affiliated, factors that make them less responsive to traditional pro-Israel appeals. Many younger American Jews, especially among Democrats, have decoupled their cultural or religious identity from automatic political defense of Israel and are weakening connections to the civic networks and institutions that once translated sympathy for Israel and durable political backing. The Israeli government and its supporters prefer to file some of the declining support under anti-Semitism. And some of it is. The Anti-Defamation League recorded 6,000 anti-Semitic incidents in the United States last year, double what it counted in 2021 and 5 times as high as a decade ago. Around the world, anti-Semite violence in 2025 killed the highest number of Jews in 30 years. The number of 2 Israeli embassy staff members outside the Capitol Jewish in Washington, the fatal injury sustained by an elderly woman in Boulder, Colorado, who was marching for the release of Israel hostages from Gaza, and the firebombing of the government Josh Shapiro's residence in Pennsylvania on Passover, while his family was home all last year, are among the grim indicators that hostility surrounding Israel can spill into violence against Jews. But Israel's made a big mistake in treating every new critic as an anti-Semite. Much criticism stems from Israel's behavior. In addition to images of devastation and hungry children in Gaza as part of Israel's brutal response to the Hamas massacre of October 7, 2023, the world now often sees footage of settlers torching Palestinian homes in the West Bank and reads about Israeli soldiers looting living rooms in Lebanon. Although these incidents represent a small fraction of Israel's conduct, they are framed through a social justice lens and amplified by social media. There are images and stories that have lodged themselves into the collective imagination, and they will not be undone by Israeli denials. There is, however, potential for change. Mr. Ben Gvir, I don't know how to pronounce that. Do we forget the G and call him Vir? And Mr. Smotrich, the most polarizing figures in Israel politics, are unlikely to be part of the next coalition government, polls indicate. Israeli elections can be unruly, and this round will be unpredictable, with over a dozen parties contention with a sharply divided electorate. Yet a change in government could lead other nations and other publics and news media to give a new coalition benefit of the doubt. Any grace period will be short, and Israel's next leaders will need to present a different vision quickly. If a new government policies look more or less like the old ones and better tailoring, the good will may very well burn off quickly, and the impression abroad that Israel's problem is not a particular set of leaders, but Israel itself, will harden into common sense. Leaders abroad who hope that a different government will revive the peace process should calibrate their expectations. No government in their future will deliver Palestinian statehood, and probably will not even come close, given the enduring security threats from Hamas and Hezbollah, and Houthis in Iran, and the lingering trauma of October 7th. But a new government could pave the way toward peace instead of actively weakening the Palestinian Authority, as the current coalition is doing. It could restore the basic administrative and economic functions that keep Palestinian institutions afloat, releasing part of the money owed to the authority and easing bureaucratic constraints on trade, movement and economic developments in the West Bank. It could allow the authorities to expand civilian security and control on issues that will remain under the Palestinian in a future arraignment. It could support rather than stall President Trump's peace plan for Gaza and pursue calibrated steps of gradual withdrawal from the buffer zones in Lebanon and Syria, while advancing serious diplomacy instead. A new coalition can treat settler violence as a crime and not provide it with the de facto impunity it now enjoys. It can halt the de facto annexation of West Bank territory. That would demonstrate to the world that Israel does not intend to occupy Palestinian land in perpetuity. Tone matters as much as policy. A government that speaks honestly about mistakes, commits to transparent investigations of abuses, and reassures the norms of democratic governments will buy time and restore some trust in the world. The task ahead is twofold: protect Israelis from real dangers and to persuade the wider world that Israel's security and its democratic character are not mutually exclusive. The coming elections may not answer everything the international community asks for, but they can stop the slide into isolation, rebuild some trust, and allow pragmatic steps that would make Israel less alone and more secure. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from May 31st, Sunday issue of the New York Times opinion section. We read from New York Times opinion section every Sunday at 2 p.m. Your reader's been Dick Shanley. Thanks for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times Arts and Leisure section, followed at 4 by a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Please stay for these readings and more throughout the day, and feel free to contact us with your comments, suggestions, with any questions you may have. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability.